Welcome to the Unlist. Hope you had a happy new year. I'm filming this particular video from a different location. It's a little bit of a retro throwback. I've got the old generic blank white wall behind me like I used to have, and the more echoey industrial ambiance. I'm not back in that same building that I was in before, but I found a suitable replacement room that if I want to have that sort of naked vibe, I can. So I'm doing it here for this video. Just like a lot of those older videos, there will also be no bottles to show, no show and tell time, nothing flashing in front of the camera. There was some person who I ended up blocking from my channel that got really mad at me because I didn't hold the bottles in front of the camera long enough for them to really see. But that's the point. I don't flash my drip or whatever, or make the videos about the bottles. The videos are always about the liquid inside the bottles. And you're lucky I show you the bottles at all, because for a long time, I didn't, right? You know this. Those of you who've been around, you know I didn't. So people like that who get really butt mad and act entitled, they just get hidden from my channel, and they're still capable of watching my videos, obviously, but they're no longer allowed to comment. And if they unsubscribe, I won't miss them. When my number goes down, I don't lose sleep over it. I'm like, whatever. It's one less person that I needed to have around in my life. Not someone that's paying my bills anyway, because this channel is not monetized. So having that one less number there is just like, you know, for me, it's like the trash taking itself out. That's how I look at it. So anyway, today's video is basically about Parfums Caron, the brainchild of one Ernest Daltroff, who was kind of later in years when he started the house, okay? He was born in the 1860s, 1867 actually. He died in 1941. So you realize when he started his house in 1904, okay, he was already in his 40s. He was like my age. Getting started with your own perfume house at my age. So that's why he didn't really live to see his house flourish into the mid-century like the Guerlain family did, because they were generational perfumers anyway, and by that same time period in the early 20th century, they were already on their third house perfumer. They had already gone through Pierre Pascal to Amy, and then on to Jacques Guerlain. So, but no, Ernest Daltroff started Parfums Caron in 1904, and honestly, I'm not saying it was a bad time to do that, because Coty really kind of got started around the turn of the 20th century too, but the setup for Caron was he was pitching product to a much higher end market than Guerlain was. I know y'all think that is blasphemy to say, but if you do your history and do your research, you'll know that for a long time, Guerlain was considered perfume for streetwalkers, perfume for consorts, you know, perfume for, to be vulgar, but the side bitch, you know. And the joke was you would buy Caron for the wife and Guerlain for the mistress, okay? So make of that what you will. A lot of Guerlain fans get really angry when people quote that line. That's been reiterated a couple different ways. I'm paraphrasing, but generally it's said along the lines of Caron for the wife, Guerlain for the mistress. Now, the positive spin you can have on that is that Guerlain perfumes were generally considered more sexy and more fun than Caron perfumes. That's the rub. If you want to really get your digs in, you can say, well, yeah, of course they're for the mistress, because the mistress is out having all the parties, you know, in the flapper outfits and drinking all of the illegal alcohol during the Prohibition era. The flapper slash mistress slash consort is out having the life of Riley, as they say. The wife is at home taking care of the kids, cooking, cleaning. She's got her fancy Caron perfumes, but that's about all she's got, right? Because the hubby's attention is elsewhere. If you want to really get that dig in, you can. I won't stop you. But the thing is, Caron perfumes were always considered to be a bit more subtle than Guerlain perfumes overall. And I won't say that they were more elegant, because elegant is basically subjective, right? You can think anything is elegant or not. So I won't necessarily call them more elegant, but they're definitely considered more subtle and more controlled. And that's the big difference between the Guerlain perfume style and the Caron perfume style. So alongside brands like Houbigant and Guerlain and others from that era, Pinot, d'Orsay, which was kind of like a French via America perfume house that was also successful at that time. And then, of course, a few others that are lesser known, like Le Gallienne, Mary Chess. There's a bunch of them. Spain had Marugia. Coty was in the runnings at that time as well. But Caron was kind of in its own little high society space compared to some of the others that were a little more mainstream. Still not mainstream. I mean, Coty was about as mainstream as you got back then. Charles of the Ritz, Prince Machiavelli, Coty, they were like the more mainstream ones, but Guerlain, Caron, Houbigant on up. But Caron was kind of towards the tip of that pyramid, if you will. And then Jean Patou came around, and Chanel came around, Lanvin and all of that stuff came a little later. And even though Jean Patou is a designer, they were kind of the cream of the crop in terms of most expensive perfumes. They even outpriced Caron effectively when they came around, despite having designer origins. But that's where Caron sat. Caron sat in the same place then that brands like Roja Dove, Clive Christian would sit in now. So adjusted for inflation, deflation, society differences back then compared to now, that's where they sat. All right, very ornate bottles. Most of them were made by Donna or Lalique. I don't think Baccarat did anything for Caron. Baccarat did do stuff for Guerlain. Baccarat definitely did stuff for other houses like d'Orsay and such. But mostly it was Lalique bottles and some Donna bottles as well. But so they had their pretty fancy bottles like many of those houses did. But the big thing, the defining characteristic of Caron, despite, middle-aged perfumer getting his start, late starting house of that nature, the other big thing about Caron, the defining quality, is that its perfumes don't necessarily attempt to be this grand abstract like Guerlain perfumes, and to some extent the other brands as well. Guerlain was all about a billion materials, all so seamlessly interblended, perfumes dosed in other perfumes, so whole perfume structures dosed into other perfumes, perfumes within perfumes, guerlinade, all that stuff, all this iterative finessing and refinessing. That was Guerlain. Caron was not like that, mainly because Ernest Daltroff was self-educated, self-trained. He didn't go to the schools that the Guerlains went to, so he kind of had to do what today's artisanal perfumers do and today's indie perfumers, where study chemistry on his own, study composition on his own, and just really trial and error until he got it where he wanted it. So that might inform why it took him until his 40s to finally launch Perfume, because he was doing it basically on his own. Now, he had Felice Wanapulla as a business confidant and muse. A lot of Felice, she was a milliner, and a lot of her clothing designs would inspire Ernest to make perfumes. And of course, Felice also famously became his business administrator so he could focus on the creative side. She would handle the books, basically, and the publication, advertisement, and such. He could focus on making perfumes. But the basic structure of Caron fragrances, they always start out with a huge central accord. Not necessarily one note, okay, or one material. Don't get it twisted. One accord, one big pillar, if you will, of an accord. That could be 6 materials by itself, okay? It could almost be a perfume, but it is the massive structural load-bearing support beam of this fragrance, effectively. It is the pylon, boom, like that. And then all of the other materials come off of the center mass, like flying buttresses on the Cathedral of Notre Dame. That is not something that you will find in a Luc Turin book. That is not something written by Tanya Sanchez or Persolace or Michael Edwards or anyone else. That is me. That is my observation. So you can say I'm wrong. You can say my nose is broken. You can call me names and also get hidden from my channel and blocked like all the other assholes. But that is my observation after having smelled a lot of vintage Caron fragrances, is the difference between them and Guerlain and many other French brands is the Guerlains are like spheres, big balls of polished, finessed, rounded, abstract, singular accords that dry down and reveal their materials over time, right? So the Shalimars and all of that sort of thing, they are just very finely filigreed and worked. But with Caron, he starts with a very monolithic, singular accord of some sort, whether it's a amber orange blossom accord, like in Narcisse Noir, for example, the first fragrance they made, whether it's like an amber orange blossom accord or something else, or with Caron Pour Un Homme, it's that big, huge lavender, vanilla tonka trifecta, right? Or other fragrances like Tabac Blonde, okay, where that tonka sort of animal leather tonka accord that fakes out the tobacco is the core. But all of the vintage Carons, okay, Nuit de Noël is the same way. They all have this pillar that forms the central core of the fragrance, and all the other materials, whether it's additional base notes or heart notes or top notes, come off like little flying buttresses to support that core. And that's how I see their perfumes. You can disagree with me if you want to, politely, and I will let you have your piece. You know, if you act like some kind of weird dickhead, though, you're getting sent to bye-bye land. I don't deal with people who take themselves and their opinions so seriously that they feel the need to attack others. Okay? A simple, I don't agree with you and here's why, will suffice. We can have civil conversation. It's literally just perfume. Now, unfortunately, you know kind of what happened to Caron was World War I really got in the way with materials and supplies and really hurt the economics of the house. And then right after that, we had World War II. And of course, the rise of anti-Semitism and fascism led Ernest Daltroff to flee France and go to the United States because he was of Jewish descent. So he didn't feel safe. And unfortunately, he would die in the United States in 1941 before World War II was over. He didn't quite make it to 80. So he was like 73, I believe, is when he passed away. So, but he left behind Felice, who then had another perfumer who was understudying Ernest Daltroff. So Ernest Daltroff had an understudy who could pick up his work. He sort of figured that this was going to happen. He was older, getting on in years. So he sort of assumed he wouldn't be around forever. So he did kind of train up someone to replace him. And then that perfumer could continue his work, continue reformulating, you know, as materials changed and such, keep the house alive. And that is what Felice did. She ran the business from France after World War II, and the American arm that got established in New York, initially by Ernest, would then be run by someone else remotely, and the two would just kind of communicate through the 50s into the early 60s. Now, there wasn't really any additional perfumes being made. The whole focus was to preserve what Ernest had created. Unfortunately, that was the first mistake in the eventual slow, I don't want to say downfall necessarily, but just slow irrelevance of the house, right? It gradually made itself irrelevant over time, whereas Guerlain, other brands and designers would carry on. So they weren't making new fragrances. The old fragrances sold and sold well, and people loved them, and obviously it kept the business a going concern for a very long time. But only one new perfume was ever created after Ernest Daltroff in the 50s, before Felice sold the business in 1962 to Revillon Frays. And those of you who know Revillon Frays, you know that Revillon had its own perfume. They were more down market though compared to Caron. So that was the thing. When Felice was getting on in years herself and had to cash out, it went to Revillon, and they more or less sent Caron down market. The original boutique in Paris had closed. The fountains, the very now famous fountains that you could literally pour perfume from into a bottle to refill yourself, like a self-service crystal flaken fountain. One of the unique parts about Caron is they allowed customers to go in there and basically do that. And those fountains still exist, but for a time that particular boutique was closed down. And it moved and it got reopened later, but I'll get to that in a second. So it was a bit of a dark period because Revillon was kind of putting Caron in the same sort of running as Elizabeth Arden, Coty, who had always been down market, brands like that. So we're talking drugstores, Sears, places like that. And no real new perfumes were coming out. That was another problem. We saw a trickle of new fragrances come out, including the second masculine fragrance from the house called Yatagan, released in 1974. That fragrance was created by Vincent Marcello, who is very well known amongst men who enjoy vintage fragrances, because Vincent Marcello also created a lot of other really dark green, sort of bitter chypre compositions into the late 70s and 80s. So he had a hand to play in the Halston twins as well. So Vincent Marcello had a number of noteworthy fragrances in the 70s. He did some stuff for Estee Lauder too. I think he did Private Collection as well. But the thing about Yatagan is a very divisive fragrance, even to this day. Okay, 50 plus years later, it's very divisive because it has a very strong, almost culinary herbal note to it with the use of oregano. It's attempting to be a very dry, agrestic sort of green leather fragrance, like leather meets composted leaves, like you're walking through the forest. The whole idea was Yatagan is a sword that was used by horseback. Ottomans, I think, used it. And the whole idea was to have that sort of wild leather horseback drawn sword vibe. And, well, the execution reads more like walking through the woods, really, with like a leather backpack on or something. But there's big green herbal notes, which would also be repeated in things like Nino Ricci's Phileas, which is another composition of his. Very divisive. Castoreum, obviously, is also in that fragrance. Oak moss. It is just no sweetness, no roundness, completely unfriendly to most mainstream noses. Then it was a bit more mainstream because people were used to having dry kind of leather fragrances in the 70s. But today it's completely alien. However, it does still sell. Now, Revilion ended up not really being able to do much with Caron, but they would release a couple other things in the early 80s. There was Infini and a handful of other things that would come out around that time as well. There was an Eau de Caron would come out. Again, they kind of took the brand a little more down market. 1985, we would see another man's fragrance, a sort of spiritual successor to the Caron Pour Un Homme, which, by the way, I didn't mention it before, but I'll mention it now. Caron Pour Un Homme was considered the first men's perfume. There were previous colognes and aftershaves and things, and Guerlain had Mouchoir de Monsieur, and there was Eucharis and other stuff, but considered proper perfume, no one really advertised a proper perfume as a men's perfume until Caron did it in 34 with Pour Un Homme. So fast forward to 85, which is 50 years later, basically. And 50 years later, we get Akiko Kamei and Richard Frays, who was the son of Andre Frays. Okay, so second generation Frays perfumer. Those of you who don't know, Andre Frays did a lot of stuff for, I think it was Lanvin. I think he did stuff for Lanvin. I think Andre Frays was Lanvin. Could be mistaken, but he had a very notable run in the early half of the 20th century. Richard Frays was the second of the Frays perfumers, and he was paired up with Akiko Kamei, and together they made Le Troisième Homme, aka The Third Man, named after the Orson Welles movie. Okay, so that fragrance really takes the structure of Pour Un Homme and complicates it. And this, some people may say that by the time we got past the Daltroff era into the Revilion fragrances and the Alès group fragrances, which came later, that the Caron DNA began to deteriorate a bit because the fragrances did get more complicated, did get more abstract. People didn't really necessarily know how to maintain the Daltroff style because it's not like he left a bunch of notes. He trained up his replacement, and his replacement eventually got old and also left, retired, or died. So by the time we hit the 50s, 60s, 70s, and well into the 80s, Caron had kind of lost its way, stylistically speaking, lost its way. So everyone was riffing, is the word here. They were riffing off of the old perfume style, the big pillar with the flying buttresses, doing the best they could to really do a facsimile of that. And you will smell The Third Man, and you will notice it does attempt to have a very big singular accord, this time being more of a carnation kind of accord, an amber carnation accord as the real strong pillar in the middle. And then all the fougere elements kind of tick off of it, like I said, like flying buttresses. Apparently, Richard Frays must have really impressed somebody, because when Revilion Frères, which became Cora Revilion eventually, right? When Cora Revilion decided to really get out of perfume and sell, they sold Caron to the Alès group. And then from the late 80s all the way until 2019. So that was a good 20-year run, 20-plus year run. From the late 80s until 2019, the Alès group more or less appointed Richard Frays as house perfumer, let him run amok. And a lot of the perfumes he made are also the subject of controversy, especially the reformulations. Now, the reason why his reformulations tend not to be looked upon so well is he was trying to reformulate perfumes that were built upon materials that no longer exist. And here's the thing that I didn't mention earlier about Ernest Daltroff. Not only was his style singular with a core accord that is then kind of expanded upon, but he was also very fond of pre-made bases. Every perfume house back then used pre-made bases, and even into the 70s and 80s they used pre-made bases because Firmenich and Givaudan and Simrise, who was Harman and Reimer back then, Takasago, all of these oil houses had pre-made bases. They would give them numbers and different things, but a lot of times the pre-made bases were designed to be a sort of starting point for a Fougère, starting point for a Chypre, starting point for an Oriental, starting point for a Musk, a leather, yada yada, etc., etc. But a lot of the pre-made bases that Caron used were from really old chemists that didn't survive World War II, didn't survive the Great Depression, didn't survive into the mid-century and beyond. So there were no notes kept, no formulas kept. So Richard Frays really could only use gas chromatography of really old specimens that were by then already deteriorating. Okay, things from the early 1900s, by the 1980s and 90s were already deteriorating. So he had to like analyze these old samples and then use his nose the rest of the way. That is very difficult, very difficult. So people want to slam his versions of Tabac Blonde and Narcisse Swan, you know, and Avion, all these other ones. You can do that. You can bash him over the head if you want to, but you got to realize he had his work cut out for him. You know, and the second generation Frays perfumer already was no joke. He was no joke, but he was a bit in over his head with that, as any perfumer really would have been, honestly, trying to recreate the smell of a pre-made base without a formula that no longer exists. Cut the guy a little bit of slack, will you? Most of his new creations didn't pan out. You know, he had a femme version of Pour en Femme, you know, Pour en Homme, but a woman's version. He made a lot of different fragrances. A lot of his men's stuff was not popular. He came out with L'Anarchiste in 2000, the year 2000. And L'Anarchiste is a very strange metallic mint, orange blossom, and musk combo. Yes, roll it over your tongue a few times. Metallic, mint, musk, orange blossom. So you get orange blossom, you get several types of mint, and then you get not one or two or three or four or five, but 7 different kinds of synthetic musks, creating this really strange, cold, somewhat medicinal, sheer, almost robotic fragrance that was way ahead of its time creatively, but people just weren't having it. Even today, people smell L'Anarchiste and they're not having it. He did soften up the top notes a little bit in successive reformulations, but L'Anarchiste is still L'Anarchiste and will always be L'Anarchiste, and that is probably why it got discontinued and re-released as a limited edition in a $200 bottle that no one is going to buy. Now, the Ales group, like Revillion Frères, didn't really know what to do with the house. They tried to take them back up market again. They reopened the boutique, reestablished the fountains, the crystal bottles that you could buy separately and put the juice into, like the old days. They really tried their best. They gave it the old college try, but they couldn't make any money because now we're in the niche era. Frederick Malle, Creed, Byredo, you know, all these big brands. Caron was just out of the game too long. They could not go up against that stuff. So Ales Group ended up cashing out to one of the heirs of the Rothschild fortune. And through a brand called Catalea Finance, 2019, effectively, Caron became a plaything of the Rothschilds. Although apparently, I believe her name is Linda, apparently she's a huge Caron fan, loves the classic perfumes, and really is serious about preserving the brand's legacy. So, you know, fingers crossed. Unfortunately, during that sale, the third generation Frays perfumer, William Frays, who was trained up to replace his father, Richard, grandson of Andre Frays, William Frays was going to carry on at Caron, carry on at Caron, yes, yuck it up. But he was going to continue making perfumes, but he was only house perfumer for a handful of years, and then he got sacked because I guess the Rothschilds just had no love for the Frayses, what the Frayses had done with the house in like the 20 years they had it, creatively speaking. And more or less every single Frays penned perfume, with the exception of, I think, The Third Man and L'Anarchiste, was kind of gone. So all that stuff retconned out, which sucks because William Frays actually had a number of really good Pour un Homme flankers that he created right before he got the can. He had a sport version, which was very nice, a low version, which was also very nice, a sort of saltier, ambergris, lavender take on Pour un Homme, and the sport version had verbena in it and more patchouli. It was a greener version of Pour un Homme, also very nice. Those just got, when he was replaced. Jean-Jacques has since taken the place of Richard and William Frays. He's done some really nice things with the Pour un Homme range. Pour un Homme Le Soir and Le Matin are very nice. A new version of the Parfum came out recently, replacing the one from 2017 that William Frays made. 2024 version is also very nice. I haven't smelled any of the flankers of other fragrances. They're doing a lot of flankers of the classic fragrances. Tabac Blonde has had Tabac Noir and Tabac Blanc. Haven't smelled those. Can't tell you about them. But one thing I can say is that it looks like they are trying a little harder than anyone has in probably 50 years. But that's it, guys. That's my video on Caron. What happens to them in the future remains to be seen because it's still too early yet to say. Hopefully you enjoyed the video and learned something. Thanks for watching The Unlist. Catch you later.